Well, first of all, Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and thank you to Congregation Shir Shalom, and especially to you, Cantor Frank, for asking me to address you this Shabbat for Jewish Disabilities Awareness Month. So, as Cantor was suggesting, a very little bit about me. I'm a lawyer by profession, now very happily retired from the practice of law. That doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it while I was doing it. It's just fun to be doing what you want. I'm the parent of two sons, Alan and David, who's been sitting with me today. And I'll focus a little bit on David as I tell you a little bit about myself. David was born 29 years ago next month with Down syndrome. And so that's one of the paths that leads me here to be talking about Jewish Disability Awareness Month. Now, the fact is that my late wife, Valerie, who passed away this past September, would be giving this talk if she were here. Valerie was a force in disability advocacy. She was among a small group that formed what Cantor was referring to, the family committee of an organization called DAWNY, which is the Developmental Disabilities Alliance of Western New York. It's an organization that's composed of representatives of the various nonprofit agencies that provide services to disabled folks in our region of the state. Now, the family committee of DAWNY was organized to bring together families of disabled individuals residing in Western New York to advocate in an organized fashion for the state to provide funding for services on a level that is sufficient for our loved ones to live lives of meaning and dignity. Let me give you a quick outline of what I'm going to try and talk about this evening. Number one, what and why is Jewish Disabilities Awareness Month? 2, what is Jewish Disabilities Advocacy Day, which is a day that David and I will observe this coming Tuesday in Washington, D.C.? And what issues are we focused on this year as we, David and I, and many others in our national Jewish community gather in Washington, D.C. to lobby our representatives in Congress on behalf of people with disabilities? And finally, more locally focused on New York State, what is the Be Fair to Direct Care campaign? And why is it critical that the message gets sent to our state legislators and governors as we approach the March 31 deadline for adopting the next year's state budget, that adequate funding be appropriated to pay a living, competitive wage to those workers who provide direct support in the everyday lives of our most vulnerable citizens, the folks with disabilities. So first, Jewish Disabilities Awareness Month. It's simply this. It's a time we set aside to focus our awareness on that group of individuals in our communities who, because of varieties of conditions that affect their abilities, are among the most vulnerable in our society, and we focus on ways in which our collective efforts can make their lives richer and more meaningful. The ways we achieve our goals are by education, which is what we're doing here tonight, and advocacy. So, advocacy. What is Jewish Disabilities Advocacy, and what issues are we focused on this year? JDAD, as some of us call it, is a day set aside, as I said, in Washington, D.C. for education and advocacy, and we focus particularly on federal issues in the disability arena that can be impacted by federal legislation, and we lobby on Capitol Hill to petition our representatives in Congress to act on, sponsor, and vote on that legislation. JDAD is a collaboration of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, an arm of the Union for Reform Judaism, and the Jewish Federations of North America, which are essentially the motherships of our national and worldwide Jewish reform and federation movements. Why is advocating for the disabled a Jewish value, we may ask? Well, we learn in the Torah in Leviticus You shall not insult the deaf, nor place a stumbling block before the blind. Stumbling blocks come in many forms, from inaccessible buildings to the lack of availability of programs or personnel to implement those programs that help provide the basics of daily living, and we're obligated to remove those stumbling blocks. So what issues are we going to focus on in D.C. as David and I travel down there so that we could spend the day in Congress Tuesday? One of the issues, and I'll only speak of one because otherwise I would have you here much too long, is the Able Age Adjustment Act, clearly a mouthful. We'll be asking Congress members to support legislation that opens eligibility for disabled people to establish what are known as ABLE accounts, which are now limited to those people whose disability starts before age 26. And we're going to ask Congress to open that up so that people whose disabilities start before age 46, an additional 20 years of eligibility, are covered. Has anybody here, just by a show of hands, heard of what an ABLE account is? Okay, I'm preaching to those who may wish to know. These accounts, they were authorized by federal legislation, much like College 529 accounts, specifically to be opened in the name of and for the benefit of individuals with disabilities. And the benefits of these accounts for those individuals are twofold. First, and here I'm out on a limb, especially since my tax accountant, the best one in Buffalo, is here, the earnings on the money deposited in these accounts are tax-free. Second, and perhaps equally and even more important, if you're an individual with a disability who has an ABLE account, the money in that account is not counted toward the resource tests that go into determining if you qualify to receive government benefits such as supplemental security income, SSI, or Medicaid. And now, why is that important? It all sounds kind of confusing. Well, most government benefits that individuals with disabilities receive come from Medicaid. I'm not talking only about health insurance, which is a big part of Medicaid. I'm talking about what are called home and community-based services, those services from the guts of the programs that provide life-enhancing benefits for folks with disabilities, like supported employment, job coaching, programs to develop life skills like money handling, shopping, cleaning, cooking, socializing. And for those folks who have severely disabling disabilities, the activities of daily living, like dressing, eating, bathing, and the like. Medicaid is the funding source for the personnel, those direct support professionals, whom I'll talk about a bit more down the road, who help hands-on with those life-sustaining activities. Now, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to you that to be eligible for Medicaid, you must be, in a word, poor. Among other things, you can't save money. If you accumulate more than $2,000 of savings in any form, you're no longer eligible for Medicaid benefits, that whole range of home and community-based services that I mentioned before. What if those Medicaid benefits, however, are inadequate to provide all that you, as a Medicaid-eligible individual, needs? So Congress authorized the establishment of these ABLE accounts so that disabled individuals may save money for a rainy day, just like you and I do, so they can supplement the Medicaid benefits they receive with additional services when necessary without jeopardizing their eligibility for the basic Medicaid benefits they get in the first place. Now, what's this Able Age Adjustment Act that my son David and I are going to be lobbying for this coming Tuesday? As you may know, the Congressional Budget Office analyzes the cost to government of legislation proposed by Congress. Well, the ABLE Act doesn't cost the federal government any money in direct expenditures. It does, however, affect tax revenue since the earnings on the dollars saved in ABLE accounts are tax-free. That's why when Congress adopted the ABLE Act in 2014, it limited eligibility to establish an ABLE account to only those disabled individuals who became disabled before turning 26 years old. It limited the pool. It limited the indirect cost to government. Well, that includes folks like my son David, who was born with Down syndrome. His disability, the onset of his disability, started at birth, well before age 26. It also includes those who have the misfortune of becoming disabled from accident or illness only so long as the accident happens or illness onsets before their 26th birthday. What if you get ill or have an accident the day after your 26th birthday? You then are serendipitously one of the unlucky ones who can't take advantage of this legislation. Now, is that any way to run a country? Isn't that discriminatory? Obviously. The short answer is to eliminate the age requirement. Perhaps it's the cost in lost tax revenue that might be realized by the government if there were no age limitation that makes us ask for something a little less comprehensively inclusive. That is, a disability onset age of 46 or earlier to be eligible to establish an ABLE account. Think of all the relatives, not to mention all of our relatives, not to mention ourselves who are finding ourselves becoming disabled as we age. Perhaps we should be able to open an ABLE account, but that might be a bit too much in fiscal losses for our Congress to get its mitts around right now. You all know the word compromise, a word we experience too little in this day and age of divided politics, and that will be my only word this evening on our overarching current political mess. So the proposal before Congress that we'll be lobbying for this Tuesday is to amend the age of disability onset limitation in the ABLE Act to raise it from 26 to 46, recognizing that this is just a partial fix because it continues to be less than all-inclusive of our entire disabled population and sets a somewhat arbitrary cutoff. It will, if it passes, still represent a substantial improvement for the disabled community. Let me turn now to the state issue I wanted to address with you. That is the Be Fair to Direct Care campaign. This campaign is all about advocating for our loved ones with developmental disabilities by urging that direct support professionals, or DSPs, who provide our loved ones with essential services are paid a living and competitive wage. The problem, in a nutshell, is that as the minimum wage has risen and the pay levels of DSPs have not, more and more DSPs are leaving the profession, resulting in high rates of vacancies and turnover in the field, and that leads to inadequate levels of service for our loved ones, resulting not only in loss of quality of life, but even risk of injury or death to our most vulnerable population, folks with developmental disabilities. The New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, or the OPWDD, serves over 139,000 people statewide. The vast majority of the people served by OPWDD are provided services directly by not-for-profit agencies, private not-for-profit agencies, some of which names locally you'll probably recognize. People, Inc., Aspire of Western New York, formerly known as United Cerebral Palsy Association, the ARC Erie, formerly called Heritage Services, which are all here in the Western New York, Buffalo area. Now, to provide necessary services to our developmentally disabled loved ones, these nonprofits employ large numbers of direct support professionals. These are the folks who work hands-on directly with our loved ones with developmental disabilities. They provide services like job coaching, teaching and helping with life skills, and for those, like I said before, with severe developmental disabilities and health issues, services such as feeding, bathing, dressing, toileting, even cleaning and changing feeding tubes, transferring from wheelchair to bed, administering drugs, and the like. These are folks who need to be able to physically handle difficult, heavy work and to make decisions of judgment that can affect life and death for vulnerable folks. Now, nonprofit agencies realize most of the revenue that they collect to pay their DSPs from Medicaid reimbursement for the services they provide our loved ones who are Medicaid eligible, and that's most of them. These Medicaid reimbursement rates, however, have not kept pace with the rise in wages, especially with the push the last few years to raise the minimum wage rates to levels that approach a living wage. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not here speaking against raising minimum wages to that magic number of $15 an hour that we have all heard about over the years. Rather, I'm talking about how the pay levels for DSPs has not kept pace. Now, DSPs as a group love their work. They get tremendous satisfaction out of helping folks that need it, and especially forming relationship and friendships with their clients. At this year's Family Committee legislative breakfast, at which our entire state legislative delegation is annually represented, DSPs told inspiring stories of the work they love to do, despite the challenge of low and less competitive pay that now pervades the profession. The jobs DSPs work at are not and were never intended to be on the high end of the pay scale. Let's look at what has happened in the last few years to DSPs and the consequences to the developmentally disabled folks they serve. Just a few short years ago, in 2012, the average DSP wage was 29% above the minimum wage. Last year, in the span of just 6 years since 2012, that wage disparity has been diminished to a mere 2%. That means that a direct support professional who virtually has the lives of our loved ones in his or her care makes just about the same as a fast food hamburger flipper. Now, I don't intend to disparage the work that anyone chooses to do, not a hamburger flipper, and not a person who cares for folks with developmental disabilities. But the effect of the vanishing wage disparity is devastating. In the last 2 years, the vacancy rate in DSP positions that our nonprofit service providers have faced has reached 14.3%. That means they have job openings for almost 15% of the jobs they need. The turnover rate has been 26.4%. That means in the last year, 1/4 of the direct support professionals have left the profession. Due to the high vacancy and turnover of DSPs as a group, they've been called on to work overtime to the tune of 12 million overtime hours in the last year. How do these very dry statistics affect individuals with developmental disabilities in real life? Think of someone with autism who has significant behavioral issues, a population that DSPs train to interact with. Success often happens when the DSP and the client get to know and trust one another and form a bond that comes from consistency and lasting relationship. With the rates of turnover and vacancy that is now being experienced in the industry, not to mention the overtime burden that adds even more stress to the job, it's easy to see the negative impact that frequent staff changes and burnout, let alone inadequacy of staff numbers, has on our developmentally disabled loved ones. Now put yourself in the shoes of the DSP, the direct support professional. Think about the stress of the job that the DSP does day in and day out and the toll that it takes. When the compensation is no more than what a hamburger flipper makes, might you think twice about staying in your DSP job, so energy draining that it's difficult to find the strength to take on a second job so you can adequately support your family? Might you instead think of taking a less stressful job, perhaps in the food industry, with the potential of finding second employment to improve your family's lot? Now, how is our Donny Family Committee, that advocacy arm that was created a number of years ago so families can advocate for their loved ones, and other similar organizations across the state dealing with this DSP crisis? A few years ago, we launched the Be Fair to Direct Care campaign. It even has a little hashtag in front of it, so on your Twitter handle you can put it right out there. Focused on lobbying our state assembly and Senate members and the governor, we asked that adequate funding be dedicated to nonprofits serving the developmental disability community to allow them, that is, the nonprofits, to increase DSP wages to levels that are competitive and provide a living wage. The past few years, the state budget included such funding at levels that made sure the problem didn't worsen, but there was little result in restoring competitive wage levels to where they'd been. This year's budget battle is heating up. March 31st is the proverbial deadline for the budget. We will, as we do every year, ask that funding be included in the budget for DSP wages. Just by way of example, the number that we're asking for is $75 million. That sounds like a lot. Against a total state budget of $170 billion, and I did the math earlier this evening, the $75 million ask is 4/1,000ths of 1% of the entire state budget, what we like to refer to as a rounding error. Now, I brought some postcards with pre-printed letters to Governor Cuomo asking to include such funding in the budget. They're available. In fact, before I came into services this evening, I put them on the square table out in the reception area nearest the sanctuary. I'll ask that each of you, if you're willing, take one and mail it to the governor. Let him know that this is an issue that's important to you. Every card, letter, and voice helps. That's how we move the needle. That's democracy at work. Thank you all, and Shabbat Shalom.